I want you to think about the last time your phone rang late at night. That specific feeling. The way your stomach drops before you even look at the screen. The way your brain runs through every possibility in the half second before you answer. My phone rang at 11:47 on a Wednesday night in April. The number was one I did not recognize. I almost did not answer. I answered. And the voice on the other end was my father's. But it did not sound like my father. It sounded like someone who had been hollowed out. Like someone who had been crying and stopped because crying was no longer the most urgent thing. He said, "Wandera, honey, I need you to listen to me very carefully." I sat up in bed.
He said, "I am at the police station. They have arrested me, and I need you to know before anything else that I did not do what they are saying I did. They are framing me, honey. I do not know who or why yet, but I need you to believe me." I said, "Dad, I believe you." And I meant it. Without hesitation, without qualification. I believed him. What I did not know in that moment was that I had exactly 72 hours before the window closed on the evidence I needed. 72 hours to find what actually happened. 72 hours to prove my father was telling the truth. My name is Wandera Luis. I am 29 years old. And this is the story of the longest 3 days of my life. Stay with me.
Welcome to Truth Hardy Stories. This is the channel where real women share the stories they were never supposed to tell. If this is your first time here, make sure you subscribe, because every story we share will stay with you long after it ends. Now, let us get back to where we were. Before I tell you about 72 hours, I need to tell you about 47 years. My father, Marco Luis, is 47 years old. He grew up in San Antonio, Texas, the son of Mexican immigrants who came to this country with nothing and built something through the specific combination of stubbornness and love and an absolute refusal to accept that the life they wanted was not available to them. My father inherited all three of those qualities in full. He worked in construction management for 20 years. Honest work, physical work, the kind that leaves marks on your hands and builds something you can point to at the end of the day and say, that did not exist this morning, and now it does. He built a reputation in San Antonio over 2 decades that was as solid as anything he ever constructed. A man who showed up, who did what he said, who could be trusted with a budget and a timeline and a crew of 30 people and delivered every time.
He raised me after my mother passed when I was 9. Just him and me in a 2-bedroom house in the west side of San Antonio. He cooked badly and knew it and laughed about it. He came to every school event, even when work made it genuinely difficult. He helped me with homework in the subjects he understood and sat beside me honestly confused in the ones he did not. He taught me to drive in an empty parking lot on a Sunday morning, patient beyond what I deserved given how many times I hit the curb. He walked me through my first apartment lease and my first tax return, and my first real job negotiation. He was, in every practical sense, both of my parents for 20 years. He was also the most honest person I had ever known. Not perfectly honest, not saint honest, but the kind of honest that is structural, the kind where dishonesty is not even really an available option because the person's whole self is built in a way that does not have room for it. When my father said, "Honey, they are framing me," I believed him. Not because I was his daughter, and daughters believe their fathers. I believed him because in 29 years, I had never once known Marco Luis to lie about
anything that mattered. And this mattered more than anything. He told me what he could in that first call. He had limited time. He spoke in a controlled way that I recognized as the voice he used when he was frightened and refusing to let fear make his decisions for him. He had been arrested that evening at his worksite. 3 police officers, in front of his crew. He said the look on their faces was the thing that hurt most. His people, watching him being put in a patrol car. People who had worked with him for years. The charges were financial fraud. Specifically, embezzlement from the company he worked for, a construction firm called Meridian Build, based in San Antonio, where he had been project director for 6 years. The allegation was that he had been siphoning money from project budgets over a period of 18 months, redirecting payments to a shell company. The total amount alleged was $230,000. I sat in my dark bedroom in Austin, where I had been living for 3 years, and I listened to my father tell me this. I said, "Dad, do you have an attorney?" He said, "They are arranging a public defender." I said, "No, I will find you an attorney. Do not say anything to anyone until I do." He said, "Wandra." I said, "Dad, do not say anything. I am coming." He said, "Honey, you do not have to." I said, "I am already packing." I hung up. I called my best friend Drea, who had a cousin who was a criminal defense attorney in San Antonio. I left a message at 11:54 at night explaining the situation and asking for an urgent callback. I threw clothes into a bag. I was in my car headed to San Antonio by 12:30. 3.5 hours on a dark highway, with my father's voice in my head saying, "Honey, they are framing me," and my own voice answering, "I believe you." I spent that drive thinking, not panicking, thinking. My father had worked at Meridian Build for 6 years. He had never had a complaint, never had an audit flag, never had a single issue that I knew of. He managed budgets in the millions. He was trusted at the highest level of that company. And suddenly, with no warning, $230,000 and 18 months of alleged fraud. Something did not fit. I spent the 3.5 hours trying to figure out what. I got to San Antonio at 4 in the morning. My father was still being held. He would have a bail hearing in the morning. I went to his house and I let myself in with my key, and I sat at his kitchen table and I waited for sunrise. His kitchen was exactly as it always was. The same coffee maker he had owned for 12 years, the same calendar on the wall from the local hardware store with his work schedule written in his handwriting across the dates, the same photograph on the refrigerator of the 2 of us at my college graduation, both of us squinting into the sun, both of us grinning. I made coffee. I sat. I thought. Drea's cousin called me at 7:30. His name was Vincent Reyes, and he was direct and sharp, and he asked me the right questions in the right order. He said he could be at the bail hearing by 9, and he could take my father's case on an emergency basis. I said, "What do you need from me?" He said, "Everything you know, starting now." I told him everything. The phone call, the charges, the company, the timeline, my father's history there. Vincent listened without interrupting. And when I finished, he said, 2 things immediately concern me. First, 18 months of alleged fraud that was apparently undetected until it suddenly became a police matter overnight. Second, the speed of arrest. Financial fraud cases of this complexity usually involve a longer investigation before charges. This moved very fast. I said, "What does that mean?" He said, "It means either they had evidence they had been sitting on for a while and chose this moment to act, or someone handed them something recently that made this happen quickly." I said, "Someone inside the company?" He said, "That would be my first question." I said, Mine too. The bail hearing was at 9:30. Vincent was extraordinary, measured and precise, and he presented my father's 47 years of clean record and his roots in the community and his complete lack of flight risk with an authority that filled the courtroom. Bail was set at $50,000. I paid it by noon. My father walked out of that building into the San Antonio midday sun, and he saw me standing by the car. And something in his face broke open, in the way faces do when you have been holding yourself together as long as you can, and then the person you were holding yourself together for finally appears. He hugged me for a long time. I said, "I have got you, Dad." He said, "I know. I always know." Vincent told us we had a preliminary hearing in 72 hours. That was our window. If we could find anything that challenged the foundation of the prosecution's case before that hearing, it changed everything about what came next. 72 hours. My father and I sat at his kitchen table that afternoon with coffee and a legal pad, and we went through everything he knew about Meridian Build, about the projects in question, about anyone who might have had a reason to do this. He walked me through the finances as he understood them, the projects he had managed in the alleged 18-month period, the budgets, the vendors, the payment processes. He said, "Wandera, I have never had access to the final payment authorization. That goes through the finance department. I submit the budget requests and the work orders, and then finance handles the actual transfers." I said, "So the money could only have been moved by someone in finance?" He said, "Or someone who had finance credentials." I said, "Who in finance would have had a reason to do this?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There is one person I keep coming back to. His name was Carl Briggs, finance director at Meridian Build for 4 years. My father described him as someone he had clashed with repeatedly over budget approvals, someone who had tried twice to have my father's projects audited and been overruled by the CEO both times. Someone who had made a comment at a company event 8 months ago that my father had noted but not acted on. He had said, in a conversation that my father overheard, that Marco Luis thought he was untouchable. I wrote Carl Briggs at the top of the legal pad. I said, "What do you know about him outside of work?" My father said, "Not much. He keeps his personal life separate. I know he has been at the company longer than me. I know he was passed over for a promotion 2 years ago that went to someone my father had recommended." I wrote that down too. I said, "Dad, I need you to get me every work email, every document, every communication you have saved from the past 2 years, everything." He said, "It is all in the cloud. I can give you access right now." I opened my laptop and I started reading. I read for 6 hours. My father slept. He had not slept in 36 hours, and I made him go to bed. And I sat at his kitchen table with his cloud documents open on my laptop, and I read everything. Work orders, budget submissions, email threads, approval chains, vendor communications. The shell company that had allegedly received the fraudulent payments was called Vertex Construction Supplies. I ran it through every public database I could find. Registered in Delaware 18 months ago. No physical address that resolved to anything real. No web presence. No history. Registered 18 months ago. The exact start of the alleged fraud period. I wrote that down. I went through every payment to Vertex in the records. Each one had a corresponding work order submitted by my father's team. Legitimate work orders for real materials on real projects. But then I looked at the approval chain on each payment. My father submitted the work orders, but the payment approvals, the actual authorizations that moved the money, every single one had been approved by Carl Briggs, Every single one. I sat back in my chair. My father submitted requests for real materials. Carl Briggs approved payments to a shell company instead of the real vendors. The real vendors never received the money. The shell company did. And my father's name was on the work orders that initiated the chain. It was elegant in a terrible way. My father's fingerprints were at the beginning of every transaction. Carl Briggs's fingerprints were in the middle, and the shell company was at the end. Without looking carefully, it looked like my father. With looking carefully, it was Carl Briggs using my father's legitimate work orders as cover. I called Vincent at 2 a.m. He answered immediately. I said, "I found it." He said, "Tell me everything." Vincent came to my father's house at 7 a.m. with 2 associates and a printer and set up what felt like a command center at the kitchen table. I walked him through everything I had found: the approval chains, the shell company registration date, the pattern of Carl Briggs's authorizations, the correlation between every single fraudulent payment and Carl Briggs's specific approval. Vincent asked sharp questions. His associates took notes. One of them ran independent searches on Vertex construction supplies and came back 40 minutes later with something I had not found the night before. The registered agent for Vertex construction supplies had a name. Not Carl Briggs, smart enough not to use his own name. The name was Sandra Briggs, Carl Briggs's wife. The room went very quiet for a moment. Vincent said, "There it is." He said it simply, like a man who had been looking for a door and had just found it. My father was sitting at the end of the table. He had been listening to all of it. He put his hands flat on the table and he looked at them for a moment. And then he looked up, and his eyes were wet. He said, 6 years. I gave that company 6 years. I said, "I know, Dad." He said, "He used my name. He used my..." I said, "He did, and we have it documented." Vincent was already on the phone. He called the detective assigned to my father's case. He was professional and direct, and he said he had documentation of significant relevance to the case that he needed to present before the preliminary hearing. He requested an urgent meeting. The meeting was set for that afternoon. The detective's name was Sergeant Patricia Okafor. She was a woman in her 40s with a calm, professional manner that gave nothing away while she was listening and gave everything away in the moment she understood something. We sat across from her in a conference room at the station. Vincent presented the documentation methodically: the approval chains, the shell company, Sandra Briggs as registered agent, the timeline correlation, the pattern across every single transaction. Sergeant Okafor looked at each document carefully. She asked precise questions. Vincent answered them. I answered the ones about how I had found the documents. When we finished, she sat back in her chair. She said, "This was provided by the company's finance director as evidence against your client?" Vincent said, "Yes." She said, "And the approval authorizations on every transaction show that same finance director's credentials?" Vincent said, "Yes." She said, "And the shell company is registered to his wife?" Vincent said, "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I am going to need 24 hours. Vincent said, "We have a preliminary hearing in 36 hours. She said, "I understand that. Give me 24. We shook hands, and we left. My father and I sat in Vincent's car in the parking lot of the police station. He said, "Do you think she believed us?" I said, "I think she is a good detective who just realized she was handed a case that was already built to point in the wrong direction, and I think that makes her angry." He said, "Why would that make her angry?" I said, "Because she does not like being used any more than you did." The 24 hours were the longest of my life. Longer than the drive to San Antonio, longer than the night in my father's kitchen reading documents until 2 in the morning. My father and I stayed at his house. We watched old movies he had recorded and could not remember recording. We made food that neither of us ate very much of. We talked about things that had nothing to do with Carl Briggs or Vertex Construction Supplies or preliminary hearings. He told me about a project he had managed 5 years ago, a community center in a low-income neighborhood in San Antonio. He said it was the work he was most proud of. He said on the day they opened it, there were children running in the parking lot before the doors were even unlocked. I said, "That is who you are, Dad." He said, "I hope so." I said, "I know so." Sergeant Okafor called Vincent at 4:17 the following afternoon. Vincent called me 30 seconds later. He said, "They arrested Carl Briggs this morning. The charges against your father are being dropped. Sergeant Okafor wants to apologize to him directly." I put the phone down on the kitchen table. My father was looking at me from across the table. I said, "It is over, Dad." He said, "What?" I said, "They arrested Carl. Your charges are dropped. It is over." He sat very still for a moment. Then he put his face in his hands. He did not make a sound. He just sat there with his face in his hands at the kitchen table in the house he had lived in for 20 years. And I reached across, and I put my hand on his arm, and I sat with him. We stayed like that for a long time. Carl Briggs was charged with financial fraud, embezzlement, and obstruction of justice. His wife, Sandra, faced separate charges related to the shell company. The case against my father was formally dismissed. Sergeant Okafor met with him in person and apologized directly. She said the case had been presented to her department with documentation that appeared complete and credible, and that she regretted the experience he had gone through. My father thanked her. He meant it. He understood that she had been used as much as he had. Meridian Build terminated Carl Briggs and issued a statement. My father was offered his position back with a formal letter of apology from the CEO. He declined. He said, "I cannot go back there. Not because of what Carl did, because of how fast they believed it." I understood that. Some betrayals change the temperature of a place permanently, and you cannot work in that cold. He started his own firm 6 months later. Small, intentional, built on the reputation he had spent 20 years earning. He called it Luis Construction, and he painted it on the side of a truck himself on a Saturday morning while I stood in the driveway drinking coffee and watching him. He looked over at me and said, "How does it look?" I said, "It looks exact right." He smiled. I took a photograph. It is on my refrigerator now. I want to say something about believing people. When my father called me from that police station at 11:47 on a Wednesday night, I had 2 choices in the half second after he told me what was happening. I could have said, "Dad, I'm sure there is an explanation. Let the process work. Let the system figure it out." Or I could believe him. I believed him, immediately and completely. And that belief was not blind. It was based on 29 years of knowing who Marco Luis was, of watching him be exactly who he said he was in every circumstance I had ever seen him in. Knowing someone, really knowing them, paying attention to who they are over time, in the small moments and the large ones. That knowing is worth something. It is worth more than convenience. It is worth more than the discomfort of going against what everyone else is assuming.
My father was almost swallowed by a system that was handed a convincing lie. What stood between him and that system was a phone call to a daughter who believed him and was willing to spend 72 hours proving it. I also want to say something about Carl Briggs. Not in defense of him. What he did was deliberate and cruel, and it nearly destroyed an innocent man. But I think about what it takes for a person to spend 18 months constructing a lie that complex. What it costs you internally to live inside something like that. I think about it, and I find I mostly feel sad for him and for what he chose. My father does not feel sad about Carl.
He feels done with him, which might be healthier. If you have someone in your life who is telling you they are telling the truth and the world is saying otherwise, I want you to ask yourself one question. Do you know them? Really know them? If the answer is yes, stand beside them. My name is Wandera Louise. I am 29 years old. My father called me from the police station with a trembling voice. I had 72 hours to prove he was telling the truth. We made it with time to spare. Thank you for being here today. If this story moved you, please share it. Someone out there needs to hear that when someone you love says, "Believe me," believing them might be the most important thing you ever do. Take care of yourselves.